rain gardens, and even open prairie areas. So you need to think about these as the overall whole watershed approach to this. Carbon sequestration helps with air quality, elimination for irrigation and chemicals as we don't mow and fertilize and irrigate turf. You know, turf being the #1 crop in the United States just is not sustainable and doesn't make good sense. So we can also reduce conventional stormwater infrastructure if we can use some of these BMPs. If you ever walk through a native area, it's amazing the amount of biodiversity and different organisms that are in a native plant area. So as we continue to build out our environment and diminish the diversity in our environment, we need to start thinking about how we're going to restore that if we're going to sustain the ecosystems that we need to have healthy lives. And then, you know, there are aesthetics with this throughout the year, and you'll see some of the slides later on where the same area changes from season to season. So it's a great way to create a pleasing aesthetic in your landscapes throughout the year. In education areas, good way to promote education and awareness of the benefits of this. And then long-term maintenance costs are also reduced, typically in the 60% range, but in some areas up to 80% annually. So when you consider what it costs to mow areas and fertilize them and to take care of them, the frequency goes down significantly when you convert turf to natives. Go ahead, Mary. So I wanted to point, there's 2 slides here. This first slide is a historical pattern of hydrology in the Midwest. And generally, you know, water would fall on the surface of the earth, percolate through the ground, pass through the soil, sometimes in days, sometimes in months, sometimes in years, but it would emerge in the low areas in a constant and clean discharge. So that's what wetlands used to be. And then if you look at this next slide, you will see that it's changed dramatically to where today, as the water falls on the surface is impervious. It goes across the surface, collecting pollutants, building up heat, going to low areas, and the water bounces up. And then as the water flows out, the water goes back down again, and that cycle is repeated. So instead of having clean, constant water flowing into our wetlands, we now have warm, dirty water flowing into what we call created wetland areas. And the plants that used to grow in the first slide don't do well in the second slide. So it's just something to think about how we, through building out our environment, have changed this hydrology, and getting natives back into the environment, back into our ecosystem and environment will help to improve restoring some of this hydrology a little bit. All right, we can go to the next slide. I had mentioned to you that turf to natives is only part of a larger picture. So if you think about our built out environment, your home where you live, the place where you work, we have buildings that are now impervious surface. We have parking lots, roof areas. So all of those areas, there's no place for the water to go. So what can we do? We need to think about pervious parking systems, pavement systems. We need to think about harvesting the rainwater and reusing it for different purposes. You can put green roofs on top of your buildings that can help to mitigate up to 1-inch rainfalls and, you know, stop some of the flooding downstream. And then we talk about bioretention systems, which include basins, but, you know, even bioswales and different types of structures to do that are all part of that. And then the native landscape, you can see then, is just one part of this overall system. So as you think about your homeowners association or your commercial property, remember that the water that's going into your basin is not just the water there, it's from the entire watershed that goes in there. And if there's anything that you can do to help start filtering and cleaning and processing that water before it gets to the basin, you'll want to do those things also. So a couple things to keep in mind here. The first thing is that plants will only grow in habitats to which they're adapted. So what were wetland plants originally adapted to? They were adapted to that first rain slide I showed you with the blue clean water. They weren't adapted to the dirty water flowing over the surface and bouncing up and down. And the second thing to keep in mind is that we are recreating native plantings in the built environment. So these are disturbed areas. I mean, typically, what you have for a basin has been bulldozed. You know, it was created during construction. And so they probably put poor soil down, covered it with 6 inches of topsoil, and said, this is our finished grade. That is not what these native plants used to grow in. So we're recreating these native plantings, and whatever we can do to create the best possible habitat for them to grow in will be much more successful. And so that's why sometimes you'll have a native basin where the natives will establish in 3 years, but sometimes they won't. Sometimes it might take 5 years for them to establish, or even longer, if you're left with nothing but gravel and subbase to plant on. Okay, we can go on. So you have a variety of different kind of habitats, and there's also a variety of seed mixes that you can choose from. So in these two pictures, in the upper left, you're taking a look at a basin bank in June. And on the lower right, you're looking at the same basin bank, but it's in August. So this is what I told you about earlier about a variety of different colors throughout the season. This is a low-profile selection. So in the Midwest, you can get tall grass prairies, you can get low grass prairies, you can get mixed forb prairies. And so you want to think about the seed mixes. A lot of good growers and people will modify the seed mixes for you depending upon what you want to do in your landscape. And sometimes, even though this picture in the upper right looks very colorful, if you look across the back of that basin, you'll notice it looks pretty green. So sometimes you have to get fairly close to these to actually see the diversity and the beauty of these things. So driving by doesn't always give you the beauty, and that's the benefit of spending some time and walking out into your natives as well. So this is one. This is a low-profile native mix. We'll keep going through these slides. These are native forb-based seed mixes. So upper left is some liatris. That's kind of a wet mesic kind of an area. On the upper right is the first 6 feet near the water edge you'll see. Some swamp milkweed, rattlesnake master, vervain, some sedges there. Very different mix than from what you'll see in the center photo, which is kind of a dry prairie mix with a lot of monarda and purple cone flowers and some milkweed and so forth. So, you know, you can see the difference there, the different habitats, the different plants that will grow in them. They're all things to think about as you're planting and converting your turf to natives. Next slide. And then later in the season, oftentimes the grasses will express a little bit more. So to the left, you'll see a basin with the grasses up around the outer edges and the sedges and rushes closer to the water. The lower right, there's some rushes there that are growing, kind of grass-like plants. And even some of the designs today, they're using grass mixes only. So turf grass is a monoculture. And if we use grasses only, we kind of have to treat our natives then as somewhat of a, it's not a monoculture, but it's only grasses, there's no forbs. And generally you'll get forbs to migrate in there, or else you're going to have to do blanket herbicide treatments to kill all the forbs that are in the native grass planting. So, you know, I think the jury is still out if that's a good way to go or not. I think the mixed native plantings are better. They're actually easier to maintain long-term. Sometimes during establishment, it's certainly easier to keep grasses only clean by broadcast herbiciding. So, you know, depending on what your application is, what your budgets are, and so forth, there's places for both. But you know, I certainly would advocate for mixed grass forb plantings as opposed to just a mix of grasses. But there's beauty in all of them. Okay, so we can go on. Just wanted to show you some different choices you had as you looked at this. So now we're going to go on to, so now you had a kind of an idea about, you know, why we convert, some of the things to consider in doing this. So, you know, where do we do it? Why do we do it? And how do we do it? Go ahead, Mir.
Do you see the
You can go on to the next slide.
pond banks?
Yep, thanks. So pond banks and edges here is one place that you can do it. And you see in the upper left-hand slide is a degraded pond bank. This was actually a turf basin that was stopped being mowed. And the reason is simple. I mean, it's easy to mow the high flat ground, but in the spring it's very wet. And if you get a mower on that bank, it has a tendency to slide down the bank. And if you get stuck in the water edge one time with the mower, you're not going to go down there again. And that's what happens. So they leave it unmowed for one season, and then, oh, guess what? Some little woodies grow up, and those little woodies turn into big woodies, and then you have weed trees there. And so what you're looking at is probably a turf pond bank here that's been left unmowed for 15 or 20 years. So that was all cleared, and so if you look to the upper right, you'll see that cleared bank, and then some regrading was done. Lower left, it was seeded and then blanketed, core blanket along the water edge for the first 6 feet, the next 6 feet with a straw blanket, and the lower right with a core log along the water edge. It looks very placid right now, but that's a fairly large pond. It's considerable wave motion, and in the winter times, the ice also creates quite a bit of etching along the side. So a core log was used there to control the wave motion until the natives can get established, and those strong native roots can then hold that. You'll also notice the grade on that bank is fairly modest, so that when that sheet of ice in the winter expands and starts to move, it can slide up over the surface of the ground. So the combination of the deep plant roots and the proper grade there will help you to reduce the edge failure that you see in a lot of basins. So even with stone there, the freezing and thawing and wave motion will eventually collapse a lot of the hard arm or stone edges that we put on. But properly done native plants, even if they can grow out into the water slightly, then have that taper that allows that freezing and thawing to simply slip up over the bank instead of etching under it and eating it out. You'll also notice in the lower right-hand photograph that we also put in a fence. It's orange. It's kind of ugly. We've kind of gone to green. We usually keep that up. This was planted in the spring, so if the planting was done in June, we keep it up to the next 4th of July. Purpose is just to keep people out from walking through there while the natives are getting established. People love to fish around these basins, and so we try to keep them out initially if we can to give them a chance to establish. Okay, next slide. You'll see the same location here in the next slide. So this is two seasons later. Upper left is in May. And what you're seeing here is the natives are the forbs that you're seeing, and the grassy area on the left is actually turf grass that hasn't been mowed. So part of the bank regrading included a little bit of seeding at the top, but the mowers didn't realize that, and so they just left it unmowed. Upper right-hand picture is in July, bottom picture is in September. Again, showing you the difference, different times of the year, the beauty that's there, the difference in colors, difference in textures, all lovely and all beneficial, much better than what that first upper right-hand slide was with weed trees and overgrown vegetation. So not only is it more attractive, it's also more functional. Okay, so that's pond banks and edges. We can go on to the next slide. This is a dry bottom turf basin. Upper left-hand here, you're looking at a rolling bottom. Lovely basin. Even in turf, it's a lovely basin. It just doesn't have any real active use because anytime it rains, that basin is pretty wet, so you can't really play baseball or football in there anyway. And this community wanted to create a natural basin. So people in the community got together and said, we'd like to have a native area around here. Can we convert this basin? And so the municipality agreed to that, the park district actually. And so on the lower right, you'll see the first step in converting a dry bottom turf basin, which was spraying it to kill the existing turf. Next slide, and this is in May. You'll see the date on that is in May. Next slide. Same basin. So in the left, this is late May on the upper left. What you're looking at there is that area that had been sprayed out had dead turf. We then broadcast the seed across those areas going in 2 different directions using a native seed mix appropriate, kind of a wet mix in the bottom, a drier mix on the slopes. We then ran over the entire area with a Harley rake, which has a spinning shaft with nubs on it that pulverize the surface, drive the seed to ensure good seed soil contact, leaving the dead turf on top as our blanket. And then on the lower right, you'll see that cover crop that was included in July, 2 months later, totally covering that area. So you want to make sure that you've got good seed soil contact when you establish that. And you'll see some slides later on where if you don't have a good turf cover like this to act as your blanket, then you're going to have to install a straw blanket to help protect the seed while it's emerging. That's the tender time when there's one root down and one leaf up. If you get a drought at that time, that plant is dead. So you want to make sure that you've got enough cover there that ensures that it stays moist as it goes through that very sensitive emergent time. And your cover crop helps to do that. This particular cover crop you're looking at here is seed oats with a little bit of cosmos in there. So as you look at the next slide, you'll see these cosmos in bloom. So upper left, here's that same area in September of the first year. And the lower right, what I wanted to show you is if you look right below the sign, you'll see a little forb sticking up. That's a purple coneflower. You'll see a yellow coneflower seedling to the left. So natives take 3 years to establish. You know, for the natives, what we were trying to do was to get those seedlings to emerge in the first year, and we were successful in doing that. This cover crop is simply a diversion to get the public to accept a native planting. They're used to that tightly mowed turf. So what are we going to give them in the first year that looks good? It's either going to be a showy cover crop, or we're going to have to increase the rate of the black-eyed Susans, and some of those will come in and give you some color, so native color as well, but you're not guaranteed of that. So we've encountered enough haters that we don't, we want them to like the area right away. And believe me, I had probably half a dozen people call me from this basin the first year, very positive comments about what was going on. Okay, next slide. So this was the end of the first season. We did this in May and planted it. This is September. This is the next spring. Upper left is the next spring. And the lower right is at the end of the second season. And what you're looking at here is up around the edge of this basin on your lower right picture by the sign are black-eyed Susans that have already bloomed. So that whole upper perimeter, remember I told you we used 2 different seed varieties, seed mixes? This upper variety included the black-eyed Susan. So they had a yellow band of black-eyed Susans all summer long. Now in the basin bottom, what you're seeing is sneezeweed, a native plant that likes wet areas blooming in yellow. So they've had 2 successions of yellow color here in their first year, very different from what they had in the first year, but now in their second season, they're starting to see the native color already. It's not as diverse as it's going to be later on, but this is a typical second season for a native conversion. Next slide. So this is another basin which we did a little more grading on. So again, kill the turf, and you'll see in the lower picture, these were the old channels through which the water traveled. And interestingly, the excavator who did the regrading for us also did these original cuts because the basin wasn't flowing. It was a flat bottom basin. So they came in and they channelized the water. But you can see even with the channelizing of the water, the basin was still left wet. You can see tire marks from old mowers and things like that in there. So this was the first step. We killed that out. Next slide. And then up in the upper left, this was last spring. If you remember last year, it rained and it rained and it rained. We had a very hard time. We sprayed this out early in the season. You can see some weed grass has started to come back in. The excavator has come back in here, created a serpentine channel through here. So in the upper left-hand corner, it starts from the inflow structure in the center of that photograph, goes to the left, serpentines around to the right. You'll see a white paint line where it comes into this sediment basin here in the foreground. You'll see another inflow coming from the left of that area, and you'll see these better from an aerial that I'll show you in a minute. So this basin was then, at this point, after the grading had been completed and it dried out, crabgrass has started to grow back, so we had to come back in and kill the crabgrass out a second time. We waited about 2 days and we came in and then did our seeding. We broadcast the seed by hand in 2 directions to make sure that we get good cover on it. And then if you want to go to the next slide, in the upper left-hand side, you'll see the Harley rake. This is the Harley rake that we then run over the entire surface to pulverize the dirt and so forth. At this point, it was July. We couldn't get into this basin until July. It's too late in the season. We had to blanket this whole basin in order to protect that seed through the summer. So that's what you're looking at the remainder of the basin has been blanketed in order to protect that seed. We had no grass left. We had killed it early in the season, hoping to at least not have to blanket the banks, but it didn't work out that way. So you got to ensure the good seed soil contact and then protect the seed. Next slide. Okay, and this is 2 months later. You can kind of see that serpentine channel coming in, and actually, if you look to the left, top left picture, that left basin actually has a little bit of cattails already starting to grow 2 months later. And then you'll see the other end of the basin here on the lower right. So this is just 2 spots. And then what we did was we came back in, we seeded this early, and then once those channels and we knew where the wet and dry areas were, that's when we plugged it. We didn't plug it with the initial establishment. Remember that plants only grow in habitats to which they're adapted. The plants that we selected had a range of wetness coefficient. So we plugged the drier ones where it was drier, and we plugged the wetter ones where they were wetter, so that we knew that they would do well in those areas. Okay, next slide. We also put up goose netting there. So upper left is the original slide, and the lower right is the finished product at the end of the first season. And this was just last year. So you can see we've changed that grade to slow the water so that the natives have a chance to filter it and to cool it before it flows out. So we've increased the distance that they go, and we've also helped to increase the amount that the water can now penetrate. So taking a turf basin to a native basin accomplishes a lot of the things that you saw on the very first slide. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. And this is what your third year plantings will look like. So some of those are still first and second year. We haven't been in their third year, but this is a third year planting that you can expect on a low profile native seed mix. The one on the left is a bank, and the one on the right is a flat prairie kind of area. Very attractive. And what you're looking at upper left is a Truax native seed drill, which some of these areas were planted with. Okay, next slide. Yep. The ones that I've shown you so far were all spring plantings. I just wanted to show you a couple of slides on fall plantings so you have a little idea. On the spring plantings, we can put we can modify the cover crop a little bit in order to give us some more visual impact and get us through that first growing season with people, not hating what they see. And I'm going to show you why they hate it. So this is a basin where same kind of practice, killed off, blanketed, seeded in September, the beginning of September. By the 23rd of September, our cover crop is in. Mostly winter wheat, a little bit of seed oats in there. We tried a little cosmos. We got maybe 3 or 4 to bloom before we got the frost. All right, next slide. The following spring, in summer, so on the upper left is July of the following year. So it looks kind of ratty. It doesn't look like the ones you saw that were seeded in the spring. And this is why, I don't like the fall plantings quite as much, because we had a whole season looking like that. By the fall is the lower right. Lots of color in there, very different look to this one, right? We've got the vervains growing. We've got some New England aster in there, a little bit of yellow coneflowers coming in. So there's a good variety of natives that are already showing after 1 year on these banks. So they're all successful, and by year 5, they're probably going to look the same either way, but it's a matter of, are they accepted? My client was asking me, Bill, do you have to reseed this area? This looks terrible. What's going on with this? So we did have to go over and seed it a second time for them, just to take care of their concern. And quite frankly, I was a little worried about that as well. But it wasn't the second seeding that created this on the right. It was the first seeding that created that. This is a fall planting. It just gives you a little bit of an idea. And then this next slide will show you the second year of the same planting. So there it is. So this is the second spring on the left and the second summer on the right. Beautiful. So they come through and they're beautiful. You have to be patient, and you just have to wait, and you have to have confidence that they're going to come in. As long as you've seeded it right, as long as you've chosen the right seed selection, as long as you put some indicator species in there to let you know that the seed made it into the soil and is germinating, you can be confident that your natives are going to come in like this picture on the right eventually. All right, next slide. All right, and then so those were basins, and I just wanted to show you one other application, because if you have basins, a lot of times if they're deep water basins, you know, the pollutants that flow into your ponds also create issues with algae and other things. So this pond was originally designed with a forebay, and a forebay is an area that's used to help filter out particulates and nutrients before they get into the pond. So the upper left-hand picture, you'll see the wall from that little path, and you'll see a second wall off to the right. I think originally this whole area was the forebay and simply filled in with soil. And, you know, I would like to have done that entire forebay, but they had a budget. So we did a smaller section. So we killed out the turf. We then excavated that area, created a little bit larger depression, channelized the water in 3 directions, used plugs, pints, and gallons. And so that's planted in July, and in September we already had bloom, and it's already starting to function to help filter out some of these things before they get into the pond. So it's something to think about. If you have a pond and you're having problems with infill or pollutants or algae problems, you know, we talked about the watershed and using other processes. This is one of them. A forebay is another tool you might want to consider if those issues are part of your problems in some of your ponds. Okay, and it's another use of natives. We can go on to the next slide. So we'll wrap things up here on this. So just a couple of thoughts here as we wrap this up. These are not natural areas, right? Most of our 95% of the United States has already been disturbed. The native landscape no longer exists. So what we're really doing is we're creating native planting. So take that opportunity to modify the seed and plant mixes to your locations. Remember, plants only grow in habitats to which they're adapted, so you need to think about what is that. It takes 3 to 5 years to get established. How are you going to make them acceptable in that process? And then what's the structure in the built environment? If these areas are very close to buildings and people, you don't want a big blue stem seed mix in there. And most of the seed mixes that you'll buy, you need to read the ingredients in there and decide, are there some plants in here that we want removed? And if so, are there any plants here that get taller than 6 feet? You know, can I have those removed? And certainly you can call the seed person you buy your seed from and say, when you blend my seed for me, please remove any varieties that are 5 feet or tall. And they'll do that for you, and you still have a beautiful native planting. But it's more suitable in an area that's close to a homeowner's building or a path that goes around it, or, you know, in a tight built environment. The areas that are more open, not a problem. Let's go taller. Certainly prairie restoration areas, tall grass prairies are absolutely acceptable. So think about some of those things. And then the next slide. So native plantings need to be an important part of our water treatment training. You know, they're not the answer in themselves, but they're an important part of that. Second thing is that water is not a waste product, right? Only 3% of the world has fresh water, and only 1% of that water on the world is potable. So rainwater is clean, that we ought to not treat as a waste product. You know, it's not to be collected, fed through pipes, and flushed downstream to flood out our neighbors. We each need to be responsible to take care of that water where it falls on our properties, so those things don't happen downstream. And then the final thing is that green infrastructure systems do require maintenance. So the thought that it's a natural area, it's a native area, don't touch it, is a fallacy, right? Man has coexisted with nature from the beginning of time. We have a responsibility to steward and take care of the earth, right? And to create a better environment for future generations. So we still have that responsibility. And so these green infrastructure systems do require maintenance to perform to their design specifications. So if you live in an HOA or a commercial development where ongoing maintenance was not required at the time of establishment, you want to consider that you may be able to restore those areas through beginning a good maintenance program. Today, any native area BMPs that are used are required to be maintained in perpetuity. So they're lower cost than doing turf but they do require some maintenance. Okay, final slide. So just a couple of things. First, I wanted to thank the county because our stormwater professionals from the county have been setting the expectations, the standards, the expectations, and the ordinances for a long time that are resulting in implementation of BMPs that are improving our environment here in DuPage County. So I want to thank them for their vision and their leadership in doing that over the years. I spent 28 years of my career traveling the United States as a consultant on grounds applications, encouraging people to use sustainable site practices, and I can tell you that DuPage County had one of the best stormwater ordinances in the country, and we still do. And so if people would at least be educated about those and use the resources that the county has, I think we'll continue to improve our living situation. However, we do continue to build out our environment, and so it makes these things even more important that we expand the use of those beyond just the BMPs to voluntary. So all the conversions that I showed you today were all voluntary conversions. They weren't because of new construction. And we need to do more of that. We're seeing more of that. We need more natives and less turf. And then I also wanted to thank the Conservation Foundation, who's saving land and saving water, and the things they've done for the last 30 years as well, and both of these organizations for working together to do it. And finally, I wanted to thank each of you who are on these web presentations, because you're the folks that are carrying this vision forward, right? We need more natives and less turf. Native plants are not as widely used as they ought to be, and I'm always surprised, because I do this for a living, I'm always surprised when I meet people who don't understand it, especially after all the years of education and enforcement and so forth, that still don't understand what this is all about. So thank you for what you're doing, for your interest in this, and your application of these things that you do to help, enrich life through improving our environment. So I think we could take a couple of questions.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Bill. Very great presentation. We do have a couple questions coming in on the chat line there. One of the questions was, what are your thoughts on native plantings in rain gardens, often over a stone base with filter fabric?
Okay. I've got to tell you, I'm not an advocate of that. There's a place for it, I'm sure. If you have, it depends on what your subsoils are, okay? So there are engineered solutions and there are more natural solutions. Each one has its place. So you have to consider the application and, what the underlying soils are like. My personal preference is for a native soil structure, and my reason is this. Water will first saturate and flow horizontally before it flows vertically. And water not only flows down into the ground, but it also moves up through the ground through capillary action. So as plant roots are in the soil, drawing water out of the soil, it creates a negative area around those plant roots, and water moves into those areas. So through capillary action, it has to move back up. And especially during the establishment time in rain gardens, if you create barriers in the soil, and we get a dry summer and it's not irrigated, you could actually create a desert there where you're planting wetland plants and they dry out. So, if we're creating a rain garden, why not create a situation that's as close to a natural situation as possible?
Okay,
filter fabric, yeah, and filter fabric I would definitely not use. I mean, the natives may punch through it eventually, but I wouldn't use a filter fabric if I was doing a rain garden with native plants.
Okay, Bill, thank you. A couple other questions we have coming in. Any suggestions for native plantings in front yard open drainage ditches?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if your local ordinance permits it, and sometimes they want to see you mow those areas simply to keep it neat and clean because other people complain. You have to see what your ordinance is. But there are low profile seed mixes for swales. So absolutely, there are varieties of plants that are adapted to that and will grow in those areas. same practices that we talked about here today. You know, you can kill off the turf, seed it in, seed it over, rake it in, and then, you know, let it grow in. Use a cover crop. It's going to take you 3 years to get the finished product.
Okay, very good. Thank you. You just mentioned about killing off some of that ground cover. What do you use to kill off the existing ground cover?
We use glyphosate.
Okay. Say that one more time, Bill.
Glyphosate, yeah, we use glyphosate, which is the ingredient in Roundup or, you know, rodeo and so forth.
Okay. I'm seeing, let's see, one more question here. We have a pond situation where water will get high during rain events and then go back down afterwards. What are solutions for this type of situation?
Well, I think that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing, isn't it? I mean, that's why those basins were created, to delay that water, right? I mean, there's certain, you have to understand some of the construction principles. So when you build your homeowners association or area, the concept is there should be no more water flowing off the site at the rate, or the water flowing off the site should be at the same rate and flow that it was before construction. And so these detention basins are built with that in mind, with outflow pipes sized accordingly, and then the detention amount of time depends on the depth of the water and so forth. But that's exactly what they're designed to do. So, I mean, if that your particular basin, you know, is holding water too long, you know, maybe you have a clogged pipe or something, but that's exactly what the basins are supposed to do. They're supposed to delay and then release that water at a slower flow over a longer period of time.
Okay, great. Just one more. It looks like one more came in here. It says, what is the source of the data of up to 80% annual maintenance savings after establishment? I think they were talking about, you know, once the basin was established, people could realize maybe 80%. Right.
So those are my calculations, and I've done those calculations, you know, multiple times. So it ranges anywhere from 60 to 80%. So and here's how you think about it. So if you have a Class A turf area, you're paying about $3,500 a year to mow turf. You're mowing that turf at least 24 times a year. You're fertilizing it probably 4 times a year. And, you know, there's other practices that you're doing there. So it roughly rounds up to about $3,500 per acre for a first-class landscape. A native area is maintained anywhere from $700 to $1,500 a year per acre, depending on the level of care. And as they get more mature, the cost actually goes down because the frequency of visits goes down. So it's a range of savings that depends upon what you were paying ahead of time and how old and mature your native areas are down the road. But be assured that you're going to save money, and that the payback may vary from 3 years to, you know, maybe a little bit longer or possibly a little bit shorter, but the ongoing savings are going to be there year after year after year.
Okay, one or two more here, Bill. They keep rolling in here. So somebody wants to know, how does glyphosate affect the soil and for how long?
Right, good question. So glyphosate has no soil activity. If you read the manufacturer safety data sheets, which most people don't, they just read what they get in the news media. If you read the glyphosate MSDS sheets or the labels, you'll see that there's no soil activity, and it is not listed as a carcinogen. It is not a known carcinogen, despite what the news media has projected. So it does not have soil activity. So golf courses use glyphosate. They spray one day and they overseed the next day. By the time their old grass is dead, their new grass is grown in. That one basin that I showed you, we sprayed that 2 days before we did our seeding, because the glyphosate gets into the plant. Anything that's green, it will get into, and it's a systemic herbicide, so it will kill it down to the root. Does not have soil activity.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bill. I think that's all we have time for right now. Maybe at the end, if we have more time at the end of the program, maybe you could take a couple more questions. But right now, we are going to turn things over to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jeff Mengler of Hay & Associates, and Jeff will be talking about things to consider when picking a native landscape or restoration contractor. So with that, take it away, Jeff.
All right, thanks, Chris. I think I started screen sharing. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes, I see thumbs up from Mary. Okay, good, good. Yeah, thanks, Bill. Great, great presentation. Oops. So what I'm presenting is based on a publication that was done for Chicago Wilderness. It was completed back in 2016, and it's available at this big, long URL website that I have on the screen. We can probably figure out how to send this out to folks if they don't have time to copy that long thing down. But the idea was to create kind of a guidebook for homeowners associations, park districts, and other organizations that were getting into converting basins, as Bill's just described, or even managing other native landscapes, even natural areas that they sort of inherit, and where they don't really have that experience, they don't have that expertise. And so there was a group of us that worked on this. This lists what the working group was back when we did it. And I'll just say that this is the affiliation these folks all had at the time that we completed the document. Many of them are no longer affiliated with those organizations. Many are. There's even one on this list that is actually no longer with us. But these are the folks that helped put it together. I just kind of served as the cat herder and the final editor of the document. So the goals here were to provide direction and assistance to less experienced organizations, as I said, on how to select and then even manage their contractors, their consultants for native landscaping and restoration within their areas, to provide them with enough guidance and criteria to ensure that their projects turn out the way they want them to be, so that they're ecologically sound, that they're sustainable, that they end up attractive, they don't have, you know, some of the reasons that Bill mentioned that people like to complain about these projects. We've probably all heard maybe a horror story or two of things that ran amok, where somebody got sold a bill of goods and the firm didn't really know what they were doing and they were left with a mess. So the components that were in this guidebook, which you can download in its entirety as a PDF, include minimum firm qualifications and experience that you should look for, how you can put together specifications for the projects, performance standards you might need to establish, monitoring and management guidelines. You know, Bill mentioned it takes at least 3 to 5 years for these areas to really get established and get going. And then what we called institutional arrangements, which had to do with the ownerships, easements, funding mechanisms, performance bonds, and things like those. So I'll go through each one of these in a bit more detail, kind of as it is in the guidebook. And really the first consideration to think about in all of this is, what are your project goals, or what type of project is it? Is it a true ecological restoration where you've inherited the care of a remnant natural area, an actual native community? Or is it restoration of native vegetation, perhaps around a basin like those that Bill just showed us? In other cases, it may truly just be native landscaping for aesthetics. But Bill mentioned green infrastructure, best management practices. It's all important, but it's sort of a key consideration to know what your project goals are, because then that helps you set what are the appropriate performance standards and what are the things that you're going to expect of a contractor you might hire to help you install it or to maintain it. I should note that this guidebook, as we put it together, was specifically not designed to include areas that were done for permit compliance. If you have a permit from DuPage County Stormwater or from the Corps of Engineers or someone like that, where it's part of your mitigation, this doesn't really get into that. This just gets into the voluntary types of projects, you know, a lot of which are the same things that Bill was talking about. You know, you want to avoid these situations where things ran amok, the seeding didn't come up, the plants didn't survive, the geese came in and ate them all. The far right picture is what happens if you cut out your invasive brush, but you don't treat the stump with an herbicide, you end up with a problem worse than you started. And so you want to avoid these things. We all know what causes the landscapes to look like these. These are caused by our friends, the geese. But in picking a contractor, you want to be comfortable that they're qualified and they know what they're doing when you're dealing with, say, controlled burns or applying chemicals to the landscape. You know, Bill was just talking about using glyphosate to achieve that initial kill before you install the natives. So it's important to probably look for some minimum qualifications and experience if you're going to contract this work out. Look for how many years of experience they have doing the work with native species. And that can be by firm and or individual. You may have a firm that has lots of experience, but those people are all gone and the guy they send you doesn't really have any experience with natives. Or you can have it be the other way around. It's a new firm, but the folks have a lot of experience from previous employers. So it's just important to check that out, set some standard for what level of experience you're looking for. Those of us in the business know that we always have to provide that on any proposals. And then ask for examples of projects that met their performance standards. Ask the contractors to provide you with references. We decided when we put the guide together that we couldn't really make a master list of who we felt was qualified. You know, we toyed with that idea. Who were the good contractors in the opinion of Chicago Wilderness at that time? But of course, that's always changing and very difficult to keep up. So this is just trying to provide you with a guidance on how to find those contractors yourself. Know that even our forest preserve districts require submission of experience. It's usually written right into their specifications when they contract work out. And, you know, doing traditional landscape maintenance or even installations does not necessarily translate into a knowledge of native landscapes. I know that Bill's worked kind of in both worlds on that, and I'm sure can attest to that, that just because a landscaper knows how to trim the bushes and mow the lawn doesn't mean he has any idea how to deal with your rain gardens or your converted deep stormwater basins. So in the guidebook, it does provide 2 examples of written qualification requirements that you could use to screen potential contractors. And we tried to give examples of all of these things in the guidebook where we could. Specifications is something that maybe when it's being done more informally by a homeowners association, you're hoping to not get into too much detail. The government agencies all use really detailed specifications that are usually based on IDOT standards that are written for road building, and then they're kind of retrofitted with what we call special provisions. So you may not need that level of detail, but you do have to be very specific on what you want a contractor to do and what you want them to include in their bids. And the specifications is kind of the way that you do that. Because at the end of the day, if you're getting multiple bids from contractors to, say, convert one of these stormwater basins or maintain it over time, those bids need to be comparable. You need to be able to compare apples to apples. So you need to be able to see their qualifications, what their experience is. You need to be very clear on exactly what you want them to do and what's their responsibility. If they're providing the plants and the seeds, if they're providing the erosion control, how they'll execute it. You need to include all of that information as much as you can so that you get what you're looking for and there's no surprises. At a minimum, important things to include in the specs should be project coordination meetings, a requirement that they have those with you. Spell out the contract duration, whether or not they're responsible for any temporary erosion control that comes up. A lot of times there can be blaming going on that when something starts to erode, well, it was the other contractor's fault, it's not our fault, but it needs to be clear who needs to resolve it. And seeding and planting, and invasive species control we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute here. So you just need to be very clear about the expectations for these things. Who's responsible for the erosion control? What is the expectation for restoration of disturbed areas? If they bring equipment in to manage your basin or your natural area and they rip up the turf, do they have to replace the turf? That should all be spelled out in advance. Is there weed control prior to planting, where Bill showed that they come in and they spray it all first and then seed? Or is it a situation where you may want to slit seed into an existing turf so you don't have that time period with no vegetation? And I mentioned the firm experience and the individual experience. You also need to make sure they have knowledgeable laborers working on a project. And one example that I thought of this morning came on a project that I'm involved with, where it's a contractor that they're fairly experienced in ecological restoration, and it's a larger scale project for a public agency. But we had to do a mowing to control some of the agricultural weeds. In this case, it was foxtail and Queen Anne's lace that were really coming in pretty heavily and inhibiting the growth of the natives we'd already seeded in. So that's a common practice. Mow the site, set the mower 6 to 8 inches high so that it knocks down the seed production of those weeds and does not impact your little native seedlings that are coming up underneath. Unfortunately, the laborer they sent out to do that, he thought when they said mow the whole site, they meant mow the whole site. So he also mowed all the sedges and the grass plugs they had just installed, twisted up all the steel T-posts they had put around those planting pods to protect them. He just literally mowed everything and set them back on all the plants they had just installed. So it's important to communicate things clearly and make sure that you have knowledgeable people carrying it out. And then this is a little bit bigger project here too in this picture. Resource protection, if there's existing trees or resources you need them to protect, and where if they damage it, they're responsible. This is a case where this was an access route through a wooded wetland to get to another area, and the orange fence is to protect the trees. And you want to have something written into your specifications in your contract to be sure that if they damage these trees, they know they're responsible. Other things to be very clear about in your agreements with the contractor is temporary seeding that may be part of erosion control versus the permanent seeding. The seed mixes, the methods of installation. Bill talked about in some cases they broadcast and they do it in 2 directions. And I just mentioned in others, you may want to slit seed into an existing turf, but be clear on what your expectations are and be sure that the bids you get from contractors are proposing similar methods or the same thing so that you can compare. The other thing I wanted to mention is, Bill talked about editing the seed mixes. A lot of times you may put out a specified list that you want in your area, and then the nurseries will come back to you and say, well, we don't have these 6 species, we want to substitute others. Know that they substitute based on what they have extra available. They don't substitute based on it being similar ecologically, has been my experience. They're just trying to tell you what they don't have and what they have extra of, and you need to be careful of that and make sure that you get the right species in the right places. And so then that leads to consideration of contractor performance standards. Make sure that you have performance standards, things that clearly spell out the performance that the contractor needs to achieve. The length of time is going to be dependent on the scope of the project. Don't let them off easy. Don't let them off early. Some things may be 90 days, although that's usually just a period of establishment, 1 year, 3 year, the follow-up management. Make sure it's very clear if that's included in the contract or not, how long the contract extends, all of those kinds of things. Who's responsible for the monitoring and the reporting? Who does it, when, and how? It needs to be all agreed to up front so that there isn't surprises and finger pointing later on. A lot of projects, the firm doing the install is not the same one doing the monitoring, maybe isn't even the same one doing the follow-up maintenance. And then you can get in a situation where they're all pointing fingers at each other. So it's just important to spell that all out clearly up front. And as I said, the goal is clear expectations, no surprises, depends on your project goals. There should be some general performance standards, survival of the plants, a certain percentage germination, certain percentage aerial cover so that you don't end up with large bare areas that didn't take, and then they act like it isn't their responsibility. You may have some aesthetic standards if it's in these kind of suburban settings. Ecological performance standards, that can be measuring the floristic quality, the density of the vegetation, things like that. And then these are all around stormwater basins that we've been talking about. So water quality can factor into that. If there's some water quality performance standards you want to achieve, if it's part of a treatment train, consider that too. You need to sort of eliminate the variables that will cause the project to fail and incorporate as much as you can to make sure that it succeeds. So let's clearly lay out those expectations so there's no dispute after the work is done. Predetermine who decides if the performance standards are met. It should hopefully be you and not the contractor making that decision. Oftentimes we're in situations where we're doing the monitoring and making the recommendations, and another contractor is doing the actual hands-on. And we each have the same client and our recommendations go through that client, and the contractor does with it what they will. But that seems to have worked out fairly well. And again, the guidebook doesn't address the regulatory things that can get a lot more detailed than that. So make sure that you clearly establish ahead of time what percent bare ground is acceptable after 1 year, after 3 years, after 5 years. Who's doing the maintenance activities? Is there a survival rate expected for trees and shrubs? Do you need 90% of what they put in to be alive at the end of 1 year? Do you need 100%? Are they responsible for replacing it? What's the minimum number of species you want in a prairie or a wetland planting? What areas are seeded versus plugged? And Bill talked a little bit about that, how they would seed in areas. Some places they waited to see how the hydrology performed to decide where to put the plugs, which I definitely would advocate for as well. And then our guidebook provides examples of standards that you can use and adapt for these things. It provides some of the language. We took examples from some of the forest preserve districts where they've hired out contractors to do work on their property and sort of simplified them so that they are examples that you can use for that. The monitoring and management itself is important to spell out, clear expectations. Ideally, the monitoring is used to drive the management and determine if your performance standards are being met. And even if it's not for regulatory purposes or true ecological restoration, it still can be useful to say what you expect in terms of setting out performance standards, a certain number of species in the total planting, how much coverage needs to be, and if you have height restrictions that Bill had talked about. These are all places to sort of incorporate that, and then you use the monitoring. The idea behind monitoring is it's a feedback loop. This is what we usually call adaptive management. So the project goals and objectives are established, you build and implement it, then you do some follow-up monitoring to see how that turned out. You evaluate that monitoring results, and then you implement the management or maintenance tasks based on that monitoring information, what it tells you about what's going on, what succeeded, what didn't, what needs improvement. And then you monitor the results of that management again, and then you compare that outcome with your project goals and objectives, and you'll still be probably not there. So then you come down here and you do some more management, and you keep going around the loop until you've really met your goals. And that's where it can be helpful to have an independent party doing the monitoring and reporting on that, as opposed to the contractor that's been building it and implementing it. Invasive species will likely be the biggest challenge in a lot of these situations, just because we're in kind of a sea of invasives in our region, that even if you didn't start with any within your site, they're all around it. Those seeds will come in one way or another. And so I'll show you in a minute the list of invasives that was in the guidebook we published, but I'm sure that it's already out of date. Always be on the lookout for new invaders. I've given 2 web pages here. MIPIN is the Midwest Invasive Plant Network. So they're kind of covering just the upper Midwest. I think they're really managed out of the Morton Arboretum, so they are kind of local. And then NASMA is the National Association for Invasive Species Management. And so they're a national organization keeping track of what the new invaders are in different regions of the country. And those can be 2 good resources to check on if you find something in your areas that doesn't look right, looks kind of invasive, and maybe it's one of our new invaders. They'll have good information on that. And on the control methods, be specific on what you expect. Some things you can leave up to the contractor, but don't leave them too much wiggle room. Methods can obviously include hand pulling for those species that you can do that on. Weed whip, string trimmer type of cutting to prevent seed set and remove the flowers. Chemical control is most common with herbicides. Biological control is still employed to some degree. And then mowing, I mentioned an example of that earlier. Sometimes you can mow to hold an annual crop of agricultural weeds down until your natives establish. But it's important to be very clear in what you expect of the contractors, what methods are acceptable to you. If you don't want them using chemicals in areas that are too near people's homes or something like that, be very specific so that you get bids that reflect that. So here's the list of things that we thought were the most likely culprits as far as invasive species in the Chicago area in 2016 when we put the guidebook together. There are undoubtedly more, and with climate change, I think we're going to see more and more invasive species coming into our area. The Corps of Engineers has a new list for their mitigation standards that's probably twice as long as this list. Other management issues that can come up during establishment of native vegetation includes the management of the hydrology, and Bill had talked a little bit about that. Another example that I would give would be some basins that I was evaluating for the village of Vola, where our office is. And there was one where there was a dead band of plants all the way around the basin, and it at first glance really looked like somebody had sprayed this band of vegetation with an herbicide and just killed it all. But I couldn't figure it out because a lot of the species I could see standing dead were the native things that are what they would have wanted there. And then upon further investigation, they basically had an outlet structure that had become completely clogged, and it went unnoticed, and it held the water levels in their basin 4 feet too high for an obviously extended period of time. And that killed all the vegetation they had just paid good money to establish. So it's important to pay attention to those things and make sure that structures are kept open and the water levels are being maintained where they should. The question was asked earlier about the rising and fall, and they are designed to do that. It's when something gets clogged and it just stays at a high level that you end up killing your vegetation. A lot of these areas are affiliated or associated with a river or stream, and so sometimes there you need to pay attention to the flooding, the geomorphology of the stream, and how that's going to affect your native landscape restoration areas. Wildlife control we talked a little bit about earlier, and I guess neither Bill nor I are going to get into that in detail, but geese are the most common culprit, and there's ways of controlling that so that they don't come in and remove all the plants you just put in, and make sure that your contractor includes consideration of that and that they know how to do it correctly. I've had projects where other contractors did the installs for me, and their goose control was kind of a joke. And in the end, all it did was got in my way, and it didn't keep any geese out of it. So there's some guidance in the guidebook on that. Controlled burning, if you're going to include that, if that's something that's feasible, that should be spelled out. and make sure that the firms are qualified to do that. There are plenty who do and who make their living burning these smaller areas. I mentioned soil erosion sediment control earlier. That can lead to problems if you sort of the opposite of the clogged outlet. You can have things that start eroding in and sedimenting over your plantings, and that leaves you with just an ugly situation as if you had the high water levels. And then trash, litter, and vandalism. It sounds kind of funny in a way, but it occurs on all of our sites in our urban context where you have man-made trash accumulating on your site, things that would clog up those outlet structures, affect things if you were doing a burn. And then, local youth just do things for self-entertainment, I guess, and sometimes that can be damaging to your restorations as well. And then finally, what we call the institutional arrangements, that had to do with the ownership. Are you working on land that is owned or is it under an easement? Special service areas are often used to fund the management of these areas, and there can be dormant special service areas that could be activated if you need to replant an area or do some of the conversions that Bill talked about. Performance bonds and sureties may be the most important item here because that's what you can ask of your contractor. Make sure that they give you a performance bond or a letter of credit that says they will meet the performance standards you've established before you release that back to them. It's commonly done in the industry. People are used to it. And that's just something that's sort of for your own security that the firm does what they say they're going to do. And then, we talked a little bit about long-term management responsibility, just making sure you have a clear idea of that. If you're hiring someone for the first 5 years, what happens after that? We all know that if we don't continue stewardship of those areas, they'll probably revert back to something less than desirable. And so make sure that you consider that long-term responsibility. It may be, a situation where every 5 years you hire a new contractor to do that maintenance. And I think that's all I got. So I think there's time for some questions.
Okay, we had a couple questions come in. Let's see here. Once an area is planted and established, what maintenance is required after that? I know you covered that a little bit with some of the spot herbiciding and stuff like that, but can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. I think that there will always be a need for invasive species control kind of in perpetuity on these areas, just because we're in a sea of non-native species in our region. And then periodic controlled burning, if that's feasible, that will sort of help maintain the native communities. And even these things like clogged structures, that can occur anytime after establishment. And those are just all sort of maintenance things that you need to keep after.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question was, what are the typical bare ground acceptance percentages at project milestones? And is there any industry standard to measure it?
Well, one of the common standards that I guess is really derived from the regulatory world is there should be no areas of bare ground bigger than 1 meter squared. And even that, you may want to specify in your contract that those need to be seeded over. I mean, it's partly your own tolerance. Do you want to have areas no larger than 1 foot square that are bare dirt or not? When you get down into the water, those areas can be larger, but when you're on the side slopes, a lot of the types of things that Bill was talking about, it should be 1 meter square or less. You shouldn't have any areas larger than that are bare ground.
Okay, thank you. There was a comment that was made that these are solid project management guidelines. Can the county post this presentation on their website for future reference? I think Mary has everyone's email. I think all the slides will be emailed out to all of the audience members. I guess if that's okay with the speakers at any rate. Do you guys have any problems with that?
Nope, it's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Just share it as a PDF file.
Yeah, so Mary will, she has everyone's contact information. The presentation is also, this webinar is also being recorded, so that will be made available also. I saw maybe one other question. Is Bill still on here?
Yep, I'm still on.
Bill, there was a question. What was the flower you used in your cover crop to add the color?
Cosmos.
Cosmos. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I don't see any other comments or questions coming in right now. Are you gentlemen seeing any on the chat room coming in?
No, I'm not. Thank you very much for having us. We appreciate it.
I'm not.
Okay, well, it's I will probably end here a couple minutes early. I do want to thank both of you guys again. Great presentations. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. So thank you again for being here. I'd also like to thank all of you, all of our audience, for joining us. This was our maiden voyage with the Zoom meetings, and looks like we'll be doing more of these in the future with our current situation with the pandemic. But we hope you have enjoyed and learned a few things this afternoon. So until next time, be safe and be healthy. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.